The Chair recognizes himself for a first round of questions. In the recently enacted stimulus measure, of fully $7.2 billion has now been made available for broadband deployment. That money will be distributed through grants, loans, loan guarantees by NTIA and by the Rural Utilities Service in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And to my way of thinking, that to some extent changes the dynamic for how we should consider universal service, and specifically broadband. So my questions to any who desire to respond would be this. How should we consider the availability of that stimulus money, $7.2 billion, as we consider, number one, making broadband an eligible expenditure for universal service funding, and potentially, number two, requiring that the recipients of universal service funding provide broadband at certain minimum speeds throughout their entire service territory? Does the availability of that stimulus funding now make it feasible with a potential funding source in order to impose that requirement? And who would like to respond? Mr. Davis.
At least I'll start. Mr. Chairman, first, we applaud the efforts of the Congress and the stimulus to address broadband and to create that stimulus package. We think it creates a very good starting point. When we looked at the cost of deploying broadband to additional areas, rural areas of our territory, it appeared to us, or we estimated that the cost of increasing our deployment from 85% to 95% would have taken around $3 billion or thereabouts. And so I think the stimulus package adopted by the Congress is a good starting point and will get us on the right path. But I think if we're talking about ubiquitous broadband across America, then I think it's a starting point. But more needs to be done, and that's why we suggest that universal service be extended to broadband facilities. I also think that it gives us a point to begin the discussion of what speeds are adequate with respect to deploying broadband. What is the speed that we need to meet today's needs and yet not gold plate the expenditures?
Let me put the question very specifically. Current law says that USF money may not be spent for broadband. I would assume there's fairly broad agreement here that we ought to modify that to at least say it's an eligible subject for expenditure. Would you agree with that, Mr. Davis?
I would.
Would anyone disagree with that? There's no disagreement. The better question is whether or not, as the draft that Mr. Terry and I have put forward would require, that we actually impose an obligation on the recipients of universal service funding to provide broadband, to do so throughout their service territories, and to do so at a certain minimum speed. It's a pretty low speed. I think we've got a megabit per second, which on today's metric is not extraordinarily high. So my question is this: does the availability of $7.2 billion on a nationwide basis in the stimulus measure for broadband make it more feasible to impose that obligation, that if you're going to receive USF money, you have to deploy it?
I think.
And Mr. Davis, I think a yes or a no at this point from you, because I want to give others a chance.
The answer would be no.
All right. Others care to comment on that? Yes, Mr. Gerke.
Thank you, Chairman.
Microphone, please.
We certainly applaud the efforts and the stimulus and very much want to participate there. Definitely agree that broadband should be eligible. We've done a similar estimate to what Mr. Davis talked about, and for our part, to get us up to 100%, it'd be about $2 billion. That's not a bill that would be economical without assistance. So what we're going to get from stimulus, depending on how that works, and hopefully it gets directed to unserved areas, and what we can continue under USF would not come close to fulfilling that. We'd certainly commit to utilize all the money that we get to continue to fulfill our USF obligations of extending the service, maintaining it, and keeping that service alive and available to those rural residents.
All right. Others care to comment on that question? Mr. Hale?
I would just say that Most of our members are deploying broadband in their areas, but there could be extremely high-cost areas with the cap on the fund where there wouldn't be cost recovery for those areas. So there could be extreme, in general, yes, we would deploy it and we are deploying it, but there could be very, very small rural areas that it would be difficult to deploy with the cap on the fund.
I'm detecting some hesitation about whether or not we should impose that requirement. Mr. Talkie.
There's no question, but it's a stretch for a lot of carriers to be able to meet a requirement to deliver broadband even at the speeds you mentioned within the 5-year period. But I think it's really hard from a public policy perspective to say that we're going to indefinitely provide funding for voice services when voice services is not what the future is about. So whether it's 5 years or 7 years or 4 years, I don't know the answer to that question. But I think once the mapping is completed, and you have a better handle on what's out there that's unserved, then you can begin to get a better handle on how much capital is needed in order to be able to meet those needs. Maybe there will have to be a little more capital provided besides what's in the stimulus package. But I don't think it's unreasonable to have some kind of requirement for broadband for those who are receiving the funds. That's the bottom line.
Thank you very much.
One more point that I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman, if I have the opportunity, is that I think it's really important that this committee provide good oversight and perhaps even direction to some of the administration's agencies that are administering the stimulus funds. There are a lot of new people there, a lot of great people, but I think this committee has a lot of history and I think probably can give some good guidance to the way in which these funds are administered to achieve the objective.
Thank you very much, Mr. Talkie, and I might comment that we are in the process of doing precisely that now through conversations with both of the grant-making agencies, with the administration, and we will actually move to an oversight hearing on that very issue in the not-too-distant future. My time has expired. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Walson, let me just ask you sort of, I want to blunt a question. I mean, obviously everybody in the room agrees that the Universal Service Fund is broken, and it's not working to taxpayers' advantage, and we need to do something. What about just eliminating the Universal Service Fund? Now, I say that because when AT&T started, they were the one carrier, and that's how the program got started. Now you can go to even, Mr. Gerke, even in my congressional district, which you serve, is a lot of rural areas, they can get service from more than Embark. So forget for the second broadband, just talking about Universal Service Fund for land lease lines. Why is it still necessary to do this?
Well, I think it's a good point that it was originally started to make sure that we brought telecommunication services to areas, and then once it was there,
why are we continuing it? Do you agree that there's a possibility we don't even need Universal Service Fund for what it's doing now?
I'm sure there are definitely areas where that's true, and if we had reverse auctions in areas like that, if everyone were eligible, all carriers were eligible, you would find places where firms bid zero, possibly even were willing to pay.
Yeah, in the bill that Mr. Barton and I dropped in the last Congress, we listed that you no longer have companies get reimbursed for artwork, cafeteria, lunchrooms, vending machines, charitable contribution, lobbying, public relations, janitorial service. All these were the costs that people like Mr. Galley or Mr. Hale used in their reimbursement expenses that they would put on top and give to the FCC. And so in our bill we said, gee, we didn't think sewage or water utilities or membership fees in social and political clubs and recreational clubs were necessary to be expenses. So we said, you know, let's make sure that they don't be incurred. But Mr. Talkie said, and I think Mr. Waxman is sort of looking at, and which is very encouraging for me, to talk about reverse auctions, and that, Mr. Walston, you indicated that would be the key here. And particularly, you talked about this identical support rule, that if we did away with that and we had reverse auctions, bingo, then we would be out of this business of getting reimbursed upon the membership fees and dues and social and political services. Is that correct?
Yeah, if these auctions were done, if they're done correctly, firms are going to want to they're going to want to win the auction, and they're not going to include costs like that because then they wouldn't win.
Now, Mr. Davis, I'm a little concerned to hear you say, when you talk about broadband, the $7.2 billion that's in the stimulus package, you say that's just the beginning. So you're asking the government to continue to tax people who are getting phone lines for a lot more than the $7.2 billion, because you realize if we spend that $7.2 billion this year, and the Universal Service Fund is about $7 billion now, so if we're going to tax them next year, it's going to go from 11% of the bill to 22% of the bill. So we're really working backwards. And then I think Mr. Gerke said we're going to spend $2 billion in broadband, and we could use the help. I think those were your words. So now you're coming here and asking us here in the committee to give you $7.2 billion this year and more money this year. And if Mr. Gerke needs $2 billion, then I assume you need $2 billion. And I'm sure everybody in this room, including the people in the last row, could use $2 billion. So, I mean, Mr. Walston, am I wrong? I mean, why should I tax people when AT&T just announced it plans to spend $12 billion in capital expenditures on broadband in 2009? And I applaud them for doing that. You know, but if the private sector is going to go out and do it, I mean, I'm not clear, Mr. Davis, why you're saying this is just the beginning. You want the government to continue to fund us through the Universal Service Fund. That's what you're saying.
Congressman, first, what I would...
Just bring the mic a little closer to you.
Sorry. What I would say first is that we believe that the size of the fund should not be increased. The size of the fund does not need to be larger for us to spend.
You believe we should tax the people who use the phone for this money, is what you're saying?
I believe that we can more wisely use the fund, reform the fund so that without increasing the size of the fund, we can provide universal broadband.
Mr. Walston, even if we took the reverse auction and we did away with the identical support rule, and let's just talk about broadband, how in the world can we go back and ask the taxpayers to pay for this broadband when it looks like the private sector is willing to do it?
Well, as you're pointing out, and as others have pointed out here, one of the, I mean, there are two issues. One is how we raise the money, and the other is how we distribute the funds. And the way we raise the money is especially inefficient. Every user of telecommunication services has to pay into this fund, including low-income users, most of whom don't receive anything. There have been many studies on this. A paper by Jerry Hausman estimated that each dollar raised in taxes on wireless services cost the economy an extra 72 cents to $1.14. Jerry Ellig estimated that these taxes on wireless services and interstate long distance to support universal service reduced economic welfare by about $2 billion a year. So even just on raising the fund side, it's inefficient and inequitable. Inefficient because it's not a good way to raise taxes. You're taxing a price-sensitive service, and it's inequitable because you're imposing the tax on including low-income people and then it's to turn around and use it to subsidize people who are not necessarily low-income. So that's the inequitable. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I hope my questions, well, they'll probably let you know that I'm new to telecommunications, but I do have a few questions to ask. I'll start with Mr. Taki. You're a strong proponent of capping the high-cost fund. And opponents say that it could have unintended consequences that could undermine the universal service goals. So how would you respond to that concern?
I think the key is to direct the money to the area where it is needed. Today, we provide a lot of support for old technology, and we provide support for multiple recipients in a given area. So as using Mr. Gerke's chart before of Indiana, a lot of money is going into the hole in that donut when the need is outside in the donut itself. And so if you can redirect the funds to the area where it's needed, I think you can meet the needs without spending more money. But if you don't cap the fund, I think what will happen is that we will keep adding on more things. So we need to redirect, not just add on, because consumers are paying the bill, and right now the bill is hovering 9.5% to 11% on the bottom of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Obviously, this hearing is in part about some of the inequities in the system, and one you raise is how the rural side of your business, the services you provide to the rural, doesn't get the support. Are you recommending the same treatment for rural and non-rural, or are you just recommending that your service to your rural areas get the support, even though you're not considered a rural provider?
I'm suggesting the same treatment for rural and non-rural carriers, such that we look at the specific geography and whether or not it's rural and support it irrespective of whether or not the company also serves urban areas.
Okay. I understand. Mr. Taki and Mr. Lubin, as I understand, both of you support going to a numbers-based system. How would you address concerns raised that this could raise the cost to consumers?
With regard to the question, will it raise the cost to consumers, my belief is I believe it will reduce the overall contribution paid by the residential consumer, that the value of having a telephone number collection mechanism is first you get certainty. You know what it is. It doesn't fluctuate month by month. Sometimes you'll pay 50 cents because you're not making a lot of calls. The next month maybe you have some family positive of life event and you make a significant amount of calls, and all of a sudden you can see a USF line item $4 or $5 because you made a lot of calling. So you see a lot more stability, but the beauty of what the coalition did that Tom Taki talked about, which AT&T participated in, is that the actual telephone number rate, when you look at it in aggregate over the residential user, was paying less. In addition, that coalition exempted Lifeline customers. So a Lifeline customer would not pay the line item, and you heard the previous speaker highlight that in the ways in which you collect it today, customers who are on Lifeline are still contributing it on certain portions of their revenue.
That's it.
I would reiterate everything Mr. Lubin said. Bottom line is that the number system, as in the way it was designed in the submission that a number of us made to the FCC, slightly shifts the cost from residential to consumer, or from consumer to commercial. So from residential to commercial. So it lowers the overall cost for consumers, and at the same time, it takes care of the low-income consumer.
Okay. Mr. Walston, you are a supporter of reverse auction. Why not base it on carrier costs as others would suggest?
The main problem with using carrier costs is that it's impossible to know what they are. And companies will always have an incentive to say that their costs are higher than they are, so that they can increase their subsidy, and it reduces any incentive for them to improve, to work more efficiently, because the higher their costs are, the bigger the subsidy they get, and so you can end up in a sort of a constant spiral of increasing subsidies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Christensen. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton, the ranking member of the full committee, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend you for rescuing me from climate change hearing fatigue. We have our second one of those of the week going on upstairs, so it's nice to come down and participate in a hearing that's on something else. It's also nice to have a hearing entitled Universal Service Fund Reforming High-Cost Support. We've got the word reform in there, which is good, universal service, which is good. I wish instead of reforming, you would have repealing, but that's just wishful thinking on my part. It's ironic to me that we have a program looking for a need to continue to exist. I would have voted for universal service in the beginning, back in the 1930s, when my district in rural Texas had very few telephones outside of the small communities and the few cities in the district. I still support some sort of a universal service requirement, I suppose, but I'm at a loss to figure out why we need to change the definition. But maybe if you can't kill the snake, it may be time to change it in such a way that we get some benefit. And I thought your question, Mr. Chairman, about a requirement, if you're going to receive universal service funds, you should have to provide broadband. I think that's a very good question. If you can't kill it, at least require something that's useful today. So I'm intrigued by that. Mr. Talkey, I thought you gave one of the more articulate opening statements. I know that's because you used to be a member of this committee, which is not widely known, and you don't talk about in polite company much more these days, but you were a member of this committee. Why would somebody oppose a reverse auction, or why would somebody support a cost-based system reimbursement? If we're going to have it, why not do reverse auctions? Why not do competitive bidding? I mean, obviously that would save money, and you would still have the basic requirement to provide the services.
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, since we support reverse auctions and competitive bidding. But as I understand the arguments of those who oppose it, is the first argument is that they favor having multiple carriers in a given area. Parenthetically, I guess first, we don't think, just as a company, it's our view.
Well, then go to competitive bidding.
If you have an unserved area, we don't see why you should support multiple carriers in that area, especially because as technology develops, those multiple carriers are going to come anyway. But for the near term, why should the government subsidize multiple players? But secondly, if you decided you really wanted multiple players, you could, through a competitive bidding process, provide that support to 2 or 3 carriers if you wanted to do that. But to try to have a system that is focused on determining costs, I think, is going to be counterproductive in a whole variety of ways, which I've already alluded to.
Well, I'm going to ask the gentleman next to you, who's an advocate more of classic universal service, why couldn't you exist in a world of competitive bidding or reverse auction? I thought your chart was informative. You know, I still have areas in my district that have significant rural areas, and so why couldn't you exist in a competitive bidding reverse auction world?
I think the most critical thing to emphasize is one of the points that Mr. Walston made, which is you have to tie it to carrier of last resort. A lot of the proposals with respect to reverse auctions allow people to come in, identify areas, and cherry pick those, and then leave me or similarly situated people to try to figure out how you make a profit on $266 per month of cost and a $25 or whatever receipt. And so if we can't isolate and leave behind those Americans, which is exactly what 254 was intended to stop or avoid, I think it's absolutely key that concept.
Well, do you accept as a carrier of last resort that you can be served in a wireless mode as opposed to a wireline mode?
Well, and that's my point, is if a wireless carrier would win, they would need to take that obligation to serve the entire area and relieve the underlying carrier, so we wouldn't have that unprofitable operation separated and then forced upon you. So I think
and I know my time's expired, but if we accepted that a wireless carrier is acceptable for the carrier of last resort, and I'm not saying that you have to accept that, but if you do, is it not true that the cost to serve as last resort would not be $266 per month?
They'd have to calculate their own costs. With our network already in the ground, and because their CFOs don't have them building out to those most rural areas, I'm assuming they've got a cost that doesn't make sense for them.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gerke, in your testimony, you mentioned about using the data that we have from a broadband inventory map as a means to retarget high-cost support either at the wire center level or even more granular. Can you explain what you mean by a more granular targeting?
Well, I'm just open to dialogue among the industry and with the committee. My thought is you want to make sure that you separate out from providing service or pollute the calculation with numbers that represent a different market than what's really being targeted under 254, which is the rural market, and the statewide averaging does that. So the wire center is a great way to target it. I think it just was an expression of our openness to figure out what's the most laser-like manner in which we can proceed.
Right, but isn't the wire center at time targeting too narrow considering the size of a rural area?
Well, as long as you're talking within a particular rural area, you can look at the different wire centers that are there and then calculate the costs based on that.
Okay. Mr. Carlson, if I may, I share some of U.S. Cellular's concern that the FCC does not have accurate mobile wireless service coverage data. What level of detail do you believe is appropriate for the Commission to have to improve their ability to administer funds? And are we talking about creating something similar to the broadband inventory map for wireless carriers?
Yes, I think the detail needs to go down below the zip code level because if you work with a zip code, you could have areas that were both high density and low density within the same zip code. And I think ultimately what we need to do is identify the cost characteristics of each area so that we could introduce a cost model that would take us away from this issue of subsidizing inefficient carriers. With a cost model approach, we would be subsidizing only those areas which truly were low density, and therefore for any carrier to serve them with high quality service would have relatively high costs. So we are advocates of high cost model system which would require us to get down to that very granular below zip code level.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Talkie, you raised an interesting proposal for the creation of the subsidy of the middle mile, the long haul between a rural internet end user and the network. Are the costs associated with developing a connection not fully supported by the current USF because it's strictly broadband in nature?
The costs of the middle mile are not currently subsidized to the extent that it's necessary in order to deliver broadband services to consumers. So when we look at the challenges of delivering service to, let's say, the eastern shore of Maryland or western Maryland or Congressman Boucher's district or parts of West Virginia, various areas we serve, I mean, the bottom line is that sometimes the cost of providing the last mile in the community or area is much less than the ongoing cost of the 50 miles of transport you have to build. And so that's why when we looked at this issue, we said this is an area that needs to be addressed. Hopefully some of the stimulus money would go to building that middle mile. But in the interim, it seemed to us that there was a need for some kind of program to address that issue, and that's why we proposed establishing a separate fund in that area. In some cases, the cost is over or almost $100 a month that we have seen for just the transport piece per customer.
Well, you mentioned the economic recovery packages. Maybe that may be some source of it. Would it go for construction then, that money? Would you see that? Or are we talking about operations maintenance? And since you're suggesting to be a temporary support, how long should it last?
We believe that the primary issue is an issue of construction or capital expenditure. Two things happen over time. One is that you get more broadband penetration, so you have more customers using that middle mile. And once the middle mile is developed and the customers have access to broadband, they are buying more services, so therefore the revenue per customer goes up. So the combination of more customers and more revenue per customer probably would allow for the operation and some maintenance costs of the last mile and the middle mile to be supported in most instances. But the upfront capital expenditure is big.
So how long it would last would just depends on how long that middle mile got developed, how many users got in before you could.
We're working on it, and maybe I'll have a better answer in weeks, but right now I don't have a firm answer. Our sense is that, it's something that probably should be looked at in 5 years. You could put it in place, have the FCC review it in 5 years, something like that. But I think that we just need to do more work, and maybe we'll come up with a better answer for you a few weeks down the road.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stupak. The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, is recognized for a total of 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I appreciate all the testimony of the witnesses. Mr. Carlson, I want to especially draw some attention to you because I appreciate your company's willingness to come into the great metropolis of Fossil, Oregon, where there are 208 households, 469 souls as of the 2000 census. I'd like you to write down the word I own Oregon, population 321, also seeking cellular coverage for the first time in its history. And they are approaching you and all. But I throw that out there because I know USF played a key role in serving an area. Fossil, by the way, is the county seat of Wheeler County. And there were very serious, legitimate concerns the community had about having no cell service when it gets a lot of people floating the nearby river and there are traffic accidents and things. So I do appreciate that. Can you speak, though, a bit about the high-cost fund and how the wireless industries each get out of this program, what they get out, and how much customers pay into the fund? How do we make this work so we get wireless service out there? What works for you, and what would be detrimental to getting that first and only service out there?
Well, I think that today, I think it's important to remember that wireless today, wireless is receiving only about 25% of the total program funds, as opposed to wireline, which receives about 75%. And, you know, I'm not smart enough to know if that's the right balance or not. But what I do know is that wireless more and more is becoming, you know, the dominant form of people communicating, certainly for voice services. And I think that the data services are growing rapidly with wireless. So I would hope that the committee in its judgment would consider to think about the future for technology and not be looking backward about where technology investments have been made, but look about where the country needs to go. And I believe that when you think about that, wireless will play an ever bigger role in bringing the best service, best quality service out to rural Americans.
And I don't disagree with that. I think there are issues related to that compensation level and the costs, and I think that's something we're all going to struggle with. And I'm not sure I agree with Mr. Walston about sort of once it's built, you could walk away from it. And maybe I'm mischaracterizing your comments, sir, but I sense that once it's out there, then whoever's cheapest at providing a service should be the one that gets reimbursed, or that's the reimbursement rate. And it strikes me that means a cellular carrier who may have a lot cheaper ability to provide cellular service might set the rate, and yet a lot of people may not have cell phones but have a line into their home. And if you're out in rural Wheeler County or Morrow County, it's going to be much more expensive to have that hard wire line. And I guess my question to you is that what you were saying in your testimony, that we'd find the cheapest reimbursement, the provider can do it cheapest, and that would become the rate?
Well, it's you have to first define what exactly it is that you want, and then you want to find the lowest cost method of reimbursing that. And if what you want is, well, in this case we're talking, the fund currently focuses on voice service, then you do want the lowest cost mechanism of doing it, and you don't want to continue supporting a very high cost approach just because it's always been there. And
so I did understand you correctly then.
If they can bid and can continue offering that service at a low cost, then that would be fine. Okay.
I want to go next to our witness from Verizon. What are the pros and cons of using actual costs versus a reverse auction or competitive bidding to determining the distribution of those amounts, Mr. Taki?
Well, first, to be clear, we favor reverse auctions for mobile carriers, not for fixed carriers, because in fixed carriers we have generally only one in a community.
Right.
We think customers want both mobile and fixed in a community, and we have a mechanism in place, whether we like it or not, that works for determining costs for fixed carriers. For wireless carriers, the problem is that first, unlike wireline, where you have an access line that goes to the home, with wireless, and you can measure how long that is, what the cost of it is, and so on. Wireless, you don't have anything like that. There's been no structure in place from an auditing perspective or accounting perspective, I should say, to keep track of all the costs and how you assign them to individual residences. You have a host of other issues, such as how you value the spectrum and so on, that would go into determining costs. So I think what I'd say to you is if you want years of legal challenges, go to a cost-based system for wireless, and you'll be in court for a long time. But if you want a system that will work, go to a competitive bidding system.
But what you're suggesting is a competitive system for each type of service delivery. Have a competitive for line if there's more than one carrier.
Well,
or how
for the time being, we'd stick with the cost-based system for wire line.
But if you can figure out,
use the competitive.
The question I would have, if you can figure out the cost-based system for a wire line, are you suggesting that wireless can't figure out a cost-based system for delivering their service?
I'm saying it's much harder for wireless because you don't have dedicated facilities. If you're talking about the donut, for example, in the area around it, you don't have dedicated facilities for the area around it, so you can't figure out what the cost is for the area around it versus the area in the donut. Second point is that I'd make is that there's been a whole history of accounting systems set up to determine cost on the wire line side. We don't have anything like that on the wireless side.
Right.
And so the challenge of putting a new system in place is very significant. So trying to come up with the cost will be tough, and as soon as you come up with a method, it's going to be challenged in court by the carriers.
All right. Mr. Davis, should a universal service broadband program operate in the same manner as voice telephone service program, or should it be structured differently?
I would structure the broadband.
You want to turn on your microphone, sir?
I would structure the broadband system differently. I would learn from what we've done in the past. I would base the broadband grants on a bidding process. The low bidder for a particular geographic area would be the only carrier that would be subsidized. We would not subsidize multiple carriers, and we would, through the bidding process, subsidize the low-cost carrier. The other thing I would do would make it a one-time grant, a grant necessary to build out the facilities at a certain service level and price, but a one-time grant, not an ongoing subsidy.
My time's going to run out. Mr. Lubin, and then I have just one comment I want to make.
I just want to make the following observation, given AT&T spending $17 to $18 billion in terms of its capital budget, roughly two-thirds of it's going for broadband and wireless. And the bottom line is that even with that amount of expenditure, we're going to have to figure out if you want to see broadband and wireless in high-cost areas, there's going to have to be some way to address that. And so in the broadband world, what we highlight is a competitive bidding process, one-time dollars, and only one time, underserved areas, and one party gets it.
All right. I thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I would just conclude by saying I would take disagreement with my ranking member's position that water and sewer shouldn't be included in the reimbursement mechanism, because I actually favor flush toilets over the outhouse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walden. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Wiener, is recognized for 2 minutes.
It's actually news to this member that you have indoor plumbing in your district.
Actually, we do have both.
Let me just say, it strikes me, and to some degree, this is an economic question for the citizens of my district. They're not underserved. They wind up, though, being donor citizens in this program. We want it to succeed. We want broadband access, and we want telephone services available. But it does beg the question that the chairman mentioned in his line of questioning. It seems if you're running pipes, if you're trying to envision how we get information, how we get technology to these homes, that we should look at it a holistic way, especially since you have this tranche of money in the stimulus bill and we have a focus on extending broadband. It seems that we make mistakes in this Congress when we try to envision technology as it is today and write legislation for it, when in fact what we should be doing is trying to create as open enough of a process that new technologies can emerge. You know, I think that the argument for the reverse auction is pretty powerful, and I frankly I don't see why you couldn't transition the present formula for wireline service to reverse auction as well. I mean, the idea is being we're trying to incentivize reduce costs and people think more efficiently and evolving technologies that might be able to do these things at lower cost. Let me hear someone, let's just talk about the wireless side, since that's the side that Ms. Tauke said that would be the best for the reverse auction. Let me hear someone, and you can decide, someone make the best argument against the reverse auction model. Yes, sir.
Well, I tried to make some of that position against the reverse auction in my opening comments when I said that if you create a single winner system, what you will have will be a single wireless provider, which means that that single wireless provider would only provide the services that it chose to provide to the people.
Why could you not have a reverse auction that the top 2 bidders win? Or why could you not have a rolling system whereby if someone during the, look, we did something similar at the advent of cable television in places like New York City, where we said, listen, it probably doesn't, it's difficult, probably doesn't make a lot of sense to have 3 or 4 people digging trenches, so let's go ahead and give one the opportunity, and then as a result, you then agree if you do that, you're going to be subjected to a greater regulatory regime to make sure you provide quality service and the like.
Well, I think that, you know, it kind of takes you back, what are you trying to create as a nation? And I think that the 1996 Act recognized that monopoly provision of services was not in the interest of the nation in an era when technology was driving huge opportunities for innovation.
Right.
By opening up to innovation, we would create an immense amount of national wealth.
Yeah, if I can interrupt here, I mean, but you're creating a straw man, are you not? Isn't the problem that we're trying to find areas that have 0 service? That, yes, 1 service is definitely less advantageous than 3 or 4, but that's a false choice in the cases of most of these communities like those in Mr. Walden's district, is it not? Aren't we trying to first and foremost get a player to come in? Isn't that the purpose of the University of Service Fund in the first place?
Well, we totally agree with that the program needs to have more targeting so that we direct more of the funds toward those areas that Congressman Walden spoke about, which have no service today or very, very, very poor service. But we believe that that can be done within the context of the 1996 Act, where there is competition. What we need is giving direction to the FCC to target the funds toward those areas while preserving competition.
Right, but I think I see that. I guess the question that I'm trying to get to here is, once you reach the point where we say, all right, we want to target this community, but we also want to do it in a way that we're incentivizing whoever comes in there to give us, meaning we the taxpayer, the best possible deal to provide that service. It doesn't seem, I mean, I think we can almost stipulate to the idea that it doesn't seem we're getting the best possible value with the way this is structured presently. So if you have a model that incentivizes the players who are represented at that table and elsewhere to say, you know what, I think I can go in there and provide this community service for on average, you know, whatever dollar per household. And 3 other firms go in there, I wonder if we can beat that. Let's figure out how we make it more efficient. We're operating now in an environment where we're trying to apportion scarce resources in a more efficient way. And I want to just caution you all, the challenge that you face is you've lost confidence that this fund, people are wondering, you know, Mr. Barton is coming at it from one economic perspective. Some of us come at it from a different one. If you don't figure out a way to start incentivizing the providers to do it in a more efficient way, we're going to lose complete confidence that this fund should exist at all. And I think one of the ways you do that is to say, you know what, we're going to start making the marketplace work for us for a moment here. And I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to rise to the defense of the cost model here. Can I ask one other question then? You know, if we are, I mean, voice is a relatively tiny part of what the larger conversation about information and is really about at this point. I mean, most of it's data, video, and everything else. Why shouldn't we just take the stimulus money, take this money, put it into a big pot, and say, let's figure out, using a model that works, it may be the reverse model or another one, and say, let's just see what technology, what people come to us and say, you know what, we can provide the full panoply of services. Why are we saying that, you know what, let's create a fund to get this little sliver of the service to these communities? I think that if we're going to do this for the amount of money that we're investing, Let's figure out a way to do it right. Let's try to really figure out a way to grow the marketplace for the services that come along with broadband and everything else by putting everything in one basket and saying we're going to try to plow into these communities and give them the same opportunities that my constituents have. Why shouldn't we do that? Is that too ambitious? Yes, sir. American Telephone and Telegraph.
Right. On one hand, I would say what you're suggesting is a clever point. And the clever point is, let's see how much of the stimulus dollars get used in unserved areas. And so Chairman Boucher asked a question in the beginning, what's the linkage between the stimulus package and universal service? For me, the linkage is at some point, however this $7 billion gets dispersed over the 2-year period, hopefully that gets used to get more broadband deployed. When that happens, you're going to have less unserved areas. My only point here is that you have money. That money is going to be put out there relatively quickly. Find out, can it work? And it's a bidding process, so it's a competitive bidding process. So you'll have empirical information if it works. My guess is, you heard the other speakers say, $7 billion is not enough. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, but you'll get empirical information once and for all. My own particular bias, and again, it's up to you. You're the policymaker. You're the policymakers that say if you want broadband, and you're the policymaker that says, do you want mobility? And if the answer is yes, then my particular belief is you shouldn't be waiting. You should be figuring out how to create the sea change, figuring it out in a way which is a coherent way, and if, in fact, this investment gets deployed and you have less unserved areas, that's a huge win, and now you're going to have whatever remains, and then you go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Wiener. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panel. This has been a great discussion and very helpful. I think every one of you have done an excellent job. A couple of points that I want to make is, first of all, we talk about advanced services, and frankly, advanced services a year ago are mainstream services today. I walked into the Verizon store with my wife trying to get her phone fixed for about the 6th time, but we won't go into that. But I saw their new VoIP system for homes. Very cool. Nice monitor, and we can do video on it and the whole 9 yards. And now that's being sold with all the regular phones. A little bit more expensive right now. But the point is that in today's society, what is advanced a few months ago or a few years is mainstream today, and we have to think of it that way. I'm pleased that Mr. Barton wants to treat the snake differently. And that's exactly the conclusion I came to, is how do we get ubiquitous rollout of broadband? 2 advantages that this bill brings is, number one, we use the same pot of dollars that already exist without creating one new dollar on the taxpayer to get ubiquitous rollout within our rural America. Number 2 in that is that by making it mandatory, what we do is say, for Mr. Galey's and Mr. Hale's that represent really the sparsest areas, they have risen up and they've provided, without the help of universal service, but just other revenues, they've rolled out high-speed broadband to their customers. But not every rural provider has, and I'm not sure every rural provider would, unless that's a requirement to take. And so this is the way that we really ensure that all the universal service dollars provides that universal telecommunication services that is mainstream today. But my colleagues bring up a couple of decent points about that universal service should be used in an accountable way for the services of which it is intended, whatever that service may be, is determined by this committee, hopefully, and not the FCC. So, Mr. Galey and Mr. Hale, I want to ask you these questions on the this question or general question of how should we go about ensuring that these tax dollars are properly used? What systems would you suggest to us? And by the way, I want to use the phrase here that the analogy with the donut, make sure that you people that are serving that donut and not the whole, the dough must go to the donut. Okay? So Mr. Galey first.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that annually my company provides a cost study to NECA, which tells them what the costs are that we have incurred in a year. That is submitted to USAC, and then 2 years after we incur those costs, we receive recovery on those costs. Annually, we also go through an accounting audit by an independent accountant. So we do have oversight over, in my opinion, my company today. Now, some of the stuff that's in the report from OIG has been contradicted in this report from USAC. And we all know that some of the things that have been reported could be interpreted in one or two ways. Now, my company will go through a USAC audit in May, so I can better address if there's any refinement needed to be made to that type of audit system, but we haven't opposed an audit system per se. We just want to know what the rules are before we go through it.
Yeah, we think that audits should be performed. The way that they're being performed are the problems that we have with the current system. In the past, I haven't been in the business as long as some of our other folks here, but in the past, there's cost models and those things have been looked at. It's just very difficult. At that point, it always came back to embedded costs because our membership, we're not alike. Sometimes someone looks at rural and say we're all rural, but we're a very diverse membership that serve a lot of different geographic areas. So it is difficult. But I mean, we would be open to discussing those things, I think. But it's very difficult to do that with a model or that type of thing.
My time is up, but I will predict that will be one of the things that Rick and I work on for our last draft.
Thank you very much, Mr. Terry. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, is recognized for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Chairman, I want to just take a moment to welcome my friend and from Chicago, Mr. Carlson, who is the president of U.S. Cellular. We work together on many issues, and I'm so glad to see you here as a part of this panel. And I want to extend a heartfelt welcome to you, as well as to all the other panelists. Mr. Chairman, this panel and this hearing will not touch upon an area that I am intensely interested in, and that is the area of access to the telephone services and the lessening of the burden that the cost of telephone services have been placed on low-income families, especially for those who are incarcerated. It's not the subject of this hearing, but Mr. Chairman, I do want us to at least to take that up as a part of our future deliberations on the reforming of the Universal Service Fund. I do have a bill that I've introduced, H.R. 1133, the Family Telephone Connection Protection Act, that will require the FCC to regulate the rates so that they are reasonable. There are a lot of families who now are overburdened, immensely overburdened because of the high costs that the telephone companies are charging incarcerated prisoners and their families to communicate with them. And so that would be a part of the discussion that I want to engage in the future. It's not the subject right here.
Would the gentleman yield to me for
Yes,
a moment?
please.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I share the gentleman's concern. And this is a matter that I also would like to look at, and I look forward to working with the gentleman as we try to find a constructive way to address it.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I also just want to say hello to my friend Charlie Sullivan over there, who has been a proponent of this for the last few years, for a lot of years, really. Mr. Chairman, I do have a number of questions. And first of all, I want to ask all the panel, for the limited time that I have remaining, I would ask the panel to answer this first question with either a response of yes or no. We can go down the line. But the question is broadband really a universal service? Is it so essential to everyday life like electricity was a century ago that we should ensure that all Americans have access to broadband? Either yes or no.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and I would add it should be also mobile broadband.
I agree, yes, it should be.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
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 As the economist, I'll say it depends. I think our resources are limited, and I would much prefer to first see things like health care be available to everybody.
Okay, all right. All right, so after we get the health care, then we get the broadband. Is that what you're saying? Okay, all right, all right. Section 54, Section 254 of the 96 Telecom Act states that universal service policies shall promote, 1, the availability of quality services at just, reasonable, and affordable rates, and 2, access to advanced telecommunications and information services in all regions of the nation. Mr. Turner and the rest of the panel, do you think our universal service policies have achieved these goals?
Not directly, sir. The problem is that the FCC has not updated its definitions of what services are supported to include broadband. However, through the magic of accounting, lots of USF-supported carriers have actually used the money that they're getting to deploy broadband services. So I think instead of doing this funny and tricky accounting, we should just make it explicit and actually recognize that broadband is already being supported by the fund, and let's make it explicit, and let's cost it out, and let's see what the support would actually be needed to bring it into the areas that don't currently have it.
Is there anybody else on the committee who want to respond? On the panel, rather?
I think we're still working on the goal. I think there's a misconception that when we draw money from the fund, the networks are paid for. Most of our companies, or a lot of our companies, are financing these networks through RUS loans. And the amount of USF money that we receive is based on the depreciation of that plant 2 years prior. So we still have debt service to do on the networks that we've built for universal service. So I think I still think it's a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Mr. Gorky?
Yes, Congressman, I agree that it's a work in progress. I do think we've shown that we can deliver universal voice and have done a good job on it. I think the targeting that is suggested in this bill to get the money where it needs to go is important. I am very encouraged by the people understanding the connection to the carrier of last resort obligation and making that part of discussion. Broadband's inclusion, I think, is a big plus and can move us forward. Agree with those comments. And last, I would echo that we're out every day making investment in new plant based on an understanding of the USF support that's there. We have maintenance, we have an enhancement, words that come from 254 that we have to live up to, and we have shareholders who are expecting that when we make those kind of investments and it's in a stable enough environment that it's predictable for them. The lack of stability sometimes really creates a challenge for us to move forward. Thank you, Congressman.
Anybody else want to comment on this?
I know that many members here, don't want to talk about expanding the program, but there was one element of the program that was not properly implemented by the FCC, and that was when the cap was imposed, there were a number of states and I could list some of them that we're familiar with: North Carolina, Nebraska, Virginia, Tennessee, Michigan, Oregon, and Washington, and a smaller amount in Illinois, states that were unfairly treated in the way in which the cap was imposed. And fixing that would cost about $350 million additional to the fund, which would raise the contribution level from today 9.5% to 10%, a very modest increase which would make it fair across America.
Mr. Chairman, I think my time is up. I want to thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rush. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was picking on you upstairs. You got the televised hearing. Climate change and the ending of the world did not. So good kudos for you.
Thank you. We deserve a few pats on the back here today.
You have more people at the panel by two. So I've been bouncing back and forth. I apologize for that. I know the chairman would have liked to, but he has to manage the chair here. Rural America, many of you know my district. We've benefited from the USF. There are challenges. Let me just ask, as we look at the USF funds to facilitate broadband deployment, does wireless broadband have a role, a practical application? And if we can just go quickly, Mr. Davis through Mr. Walston.
I think that broadband support should be technology neutral. So I think that once we determine what the speed, the level of service, and the price should be, it shouldn't depend, that any technology should be applicable or available.
Thank you.
I also think it should be technology neutral, but I also think clearly the policymakers, namely yourselves, need to decide whether mobility, advanced mobility, is important as well as fixed broadband. And if they are, then you need to figure out what's a rational plan for both.
Because I've successfully tried to stay on the fence in this process so far, so I'm trying to figure it all out. Mr. Carlson?
Yes, I think both are important. I think the speed that is capable in a wired system is higher than it is in a mobile system, so that target speed for mobility should be set at a level that's different than the target speed for wired.
Ms. Galey?
I would agree with Mr. Carlson that wired can provide bigger pipes to a residence. The mobile can provide a smaller pipe that you can carry with you to different locations.
Great. Keep going.
I think they both have their utility. Wireless is definitely going to play a role in the areas of the most extremely high cost to serve, but wireline will always have the advantage of having more capacity and not being a shared medium. So I think we really need to look at that. I'm not sure at this point that checking your Facebook while driving 70 miles an hour down the road is an essential service that should be subsidized.
You haven't talked to my son yet.
Just to be clear, I think it should be fixed versus mobile. And fixed should be reimbursed as it is today, and generally we call that wireline, but it also can be fixed wireless. And the other is mobile, and I think Americans today see mobile as essential.
Well, I think that's a good point, because I tell you, in a rural community that has a couple hundred residents, hooking it up versus having a tower that's fixed wireless is a different ballgame than checking your Facebook as you're driving down the road. Mr. Girk?
Yes, I think it's real important. It's real important, as mentioned before, to define exactly the criteria you're going after. I think generally the wireline plan is what's going to get you there, and then making sure that that obligation is to serve the entire donut, that you don't just serve part of it, but you have that carrier of last resort obligation to serve all of it.
And being in rural America, there's problems with line of sight and terrain and stuff, and I understand that also. Mr. Hale?
I believe it should be technology neutral. I don't think we can imagine tomorrow's technology, what we're going to ask to use for broadband deployment, as long as the minimum speeds and those standards are high enough to support what we need for the future of the country. Technology shouldn't play a role.
Mr. Walston?
Yeah, I mean, once you decide what type of service it is that you want to guarantee, then it should, as everyone has said, basically be technology neutral. I think the key is to make sure that you don't define the service in a way that arbitrarily benefits one type of provider just in order to benefit that provider.
Thank you. And two final questions, well, just to each one panelist, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Mr. Turner, Ranking Member Barton's got a credible beef of some of the abuse of the USF, and that's going to cause a lot of challenge for us in this committee. Have you identified in the way high-cost funding is currently distributed to wireline and wireless carriers, or what excesses have you identified?
Well, I think one of the most important things that hasn't come up in this hearing is a lot of these rural carriers are supported based on historical cost, when the most efficient way of supporting them should be a forward-looking cost, if we're going to use cost models. The often talked about $970 billion in overpayments identified by the FCC OIG it's not that there was actually $970 million overpayments. It's that these companies didn't keep good historical records of their costs, and the audit triggered that being an overcost. I think going forward with forward-looking costs is the best way to go. It's economical. I certainly would like to be able to recover the historical costs for my house that I bought 2 years ago, but unfortunately that's not what the market will bear today.
It's the chair.
Mr. Gerke, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I get in the record. We absolutely encourage transparency, and we're willing to make sure that we do whatever is necessary so that you can see that these dollars are spent exactly the way they should be. In 2008, we had 7 audits. No material weaknesses, deficiencies. We weren't penalized. No consent agreements. There was $92,000 more that should have been paid to us. There was $18,000 more that we should have paid in. So net, we were shorted $74,000. We're not looking for that. But it shows up as $110,000 of mistakes the way it's counted. And so I don't know how much of those 8 audits go into the 23%, but I suspect whatever those dollars were, they actually were in our favor. And the costs we incur, we want transparency. Let's do it in a manner that doesn't drive costs that way, way exceed the numbers that we're talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just end by saying I wonder how much the actual audits cost.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus, and I'm glad you raised the question of the legitimacy of the audit itself, because I think there are some substantial questions about the methodology that it used, and that's a matter into which we will inquire further at the proper time. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this very important hearing, and I will try not to consume my entire 5 minutes. Like John Shimkins, I would like to apologize to you for being late for your hearing. We've been bouncing between 2 subcommittees, both in this building, but thank you very much. Thank the witnesses for your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you as you chair this committee. You and I are friends, and we have similar congressional districts, and I pledge to you my complete support as we go forward with this subcommittee. Mr. Chairman, according to a recent analysis from the 2007 American Community Survey, my district in eastern North Carolina now has the fourth lowest median household income out of all 435 congressional districts in the House. That figure, along with the sprawling, very rural geographic characteristics of my congressional district, make issues like this very important to me. While there is no question that an escalating contribution factor is rightfully a concern for carriers and policymakers, and certainly the FCC, I remain confident that a sensible resolution can be achieved that recognizes and upholds the universal service concept, makes advanced telecommunications service, including broadband, a part of the universal service scope, and upholds those principles outlined in Section 254. And so thank you very much for convening this hearing today. Thank the witnesses for coming, including my good friend Tom Gerke, who represents Embark, who is a good corporate citizen in my district, and thank you for all that you do. I have one brief question, and then I will close, and let me address this to I guess, my friend from Verizon, the former member of this body, Mr. Talkie. There have been proposals floated to allow the Lifeline and Link Up program to help lower-income people purchase computers so they can access the Internet. There were also proposals to allow the program to pay for broadband. Are these good ideas? Should the government be looking at other ways to increase computer ownership and subsidize monthly broadband access for low-income consumers?
First, on the issue of subsidizing broadband access for low-income consumers, we believe it's appropriate to look at the feasibility of having a Lifeline-type program for broadband access. We don't have a specific proposal. I think there are issues that need to be addressed relating to it, but I think that it's something worth looking at, and also that it should be done at the federal level, since broadband services are federally regulated. On the issue of computers, I don't think we would look to using the Universal Service Fund to support computers, because the Universal Service Fund is paid for, as Mr. Carlson noted, is really consumers' money that we collect. and its consumers of communication services. And while we'd feel comfortable using that funding for communication services, I don't know that we would agree that it should be used for computers. However, if you ask my boss, the CEO of Verizon, what could we do to encourage broadband deployment, he'd say the most important thing you can do is to increase demand, and the most important way to increase demand is to get a computer in the hands of every kid in America. So I think we recognize that that's very valuable.
Thank you. Would AT&T associate itself with those comments in substance?
Yes, in fact, AT&T has been looking and recently shared some thoughts in terms of how to potentially have a lifeline program on broadband, and we would be glad to share that with you.
Thank you very much. And speaking of association, Mr. Chairman, I also want to associate myself with the comments of Chairman Rush a few minutes ago about H.R. 1133. That is a very significant piece of legislation. Before I had a life in this body, I served as a judge, and I received very heartbreaking letters from families about the expensive cost of long-distance phone calls for their loved ones in prison. It's an issue that we need to talk about and come to a sensible solution. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Butterfield, and I share the concerns you and Mr. Rush have expressed about that matter as well. I want to ask unanimous consent that there be included in the record a written statement from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a written statement of testimony from the American Homeowners Grassroots Alliance. Without objection, so ordered. The record of this hearing will remain open for a reasonable period until members can submit written questions to our panel of witnesses. When they are received by you, I hope you will respond promptly. And with the Chair's thanks for what has been, I think, an interesting and stimulating discussion today, we appreciate your being with us and sharing your very useful information. This hearing is adjourned.